On behalf of the Healthier Kids Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium on digital health for youth. My name is Melinda Snavely, and I have the great pleasure of working for the Healthier Kids Foundation as our Chief Executive Officer. We are so grateful that you've chosen to spend time with us as we explore one of the most pressing topics affecting the health and well-being of our children in today's digital age. At Healthier Kids Foundation, we believe every child deserves equitable access to quality care. Every day, we work side by side with families and those who love and care for kids to identify and eliminate health barriers so that they can joyfully climb the ladder of life. This symposium is an extension of that mission. In a world where screens are ever present, offering entertainment, education, and connection, we know the importance of supporting youth in finding a healthy balance with technology. Too much screen time can quietly chip away at the things that matter most for a child's development: their sleep, their movement, their emotional connection, and play. That's why we're here: learn, to share, and to partner on innovative strategies that ensure kids thrive both online and offline. Before we dive into today's conversation, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some important supporters who made this event possible. A warm thank you to our presenting sponsors, Anthem and PNC Bank. Your leadership and generosity fuel the important work we do. We're also incredibly grateful to our additional sponsors: First Five of Santa Clara County, Commercial Bank of California, Gardner Health Services, Cadango, and the law firm of Hooper Kropelka. Your investment in children's health is deeply appreciated. I'd also like to take the opportunity to recognize some community leaders who are with us today. Please welcome Board Trustee Chris Miller from Campbell Union School District, Board Trustee Anya O'Donovan from Campbell Union High School District, representing San Jose Councilmember Pamela Campos' office, Tolentino Buzo, and representing San Jose Councilmember George Casey's office is Aaron Zeeling. And finally, to the incredible coordinating staff of Richard and Abby and Victoria, who work so closely together behind the scenes to make this event possible. Events like this don't come together without vision, dedication, and heart. As we prepare to hear from today's panel, I want to take a moment to spotlight a resource that offers a deeper insight to the well-being of children right here in our community. Healthier Kids Foundation is proud to co-sponsor the Children's Data Book alongside the County of Santa Clara, Kids in Common, and the Santa Clara County Office of Education. This powerful resource offers a comprehensive look at conditions shaping our children's lives across the county, from physical and mental health to education, economic stability, and yes, even digital access and safety. If today's conversation spark questions about the broader context of youth health and how digital habits intersect with other challenges kids face, I encourage you to explore the Kids Data Book. It's a valuable tool for educators, health professionals, advocates, and policymakers who want to make informed, equity-centered decisions for children and families. You can find the latest edition of on the Kids in Common website or through the QR code on the screen. And we'd be happy to connect you with it after today's session if you'd like a physical copy. Now, let's set the stage for today's discussion. Throughout the morning, we'll hear from experts in pediatric health, digital well-being, and community advocacy. Together, we'll reflect on how to navigate the digital landscape with intention, creativity, and compassion so that every child has the opportunity to grow up in a healthy, connected, and resilient community. And with that, it's my great pleasure to honor our moderator for today's symposium. Katie Rodriguez, will you please join me up here? Katie is a passionate advocate for youth and families and brings both expertise and heart to this work. We're lucky to have her here guiding today's conversation. Thank you again for being here, and let's get started. Katie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you all for being here also and spending your morning with us. At this time, I'll invite our panel members to join me in the front while I take care of some basic housekeeping items. So I hope all of you were able to scan the Kids Data Book. And now, if you can please silence your cell phones, consider putting them on Do Not Disturb for the next hour and a half so that we can really focus on what we're talking about today and really engage in healthy digital device use. A couple other housekeeping items. If you need to leave the theater, please exit to your left and then go back out the way that you came. We do have cameras here in the front that are recording, so we want to make sure that we walk in front of them. And then if you need to use the restrooms, those are also in the lobby. You all have cards on your on the little tables in front of you, and there's pens every couple of chairs. You can use those to take notes, or if you would like to ask any questions that the panel doesn't address during their conversation, we'll let you know when you can pass your cards to the end of the aisle, and then staff members will come and pick those up so we can make sure that we address all of the questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel members. In the programs that are on the little tables, they have their full bios in there for you to look at. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, not necessarily the order that they're sitting in. So when I introduce you, you can just kind of wave to them so they know who you are. First, we have Dr. Fiona Baker. She's a leading sleep and neuroscience researcher at SRI International in Menlo Park, where she explores how sleep and brain function change during childhood and adolescence. Dr. Marianne Dewan is a nationally recognized education leader who has served as county superintendent of schools and currently sits on the board of Palo Alto University, Kids in Common, Second Harvest of Silicon Valley, and the Valley Health Foundation. Dr. Omar Gudino is a child psychologist and deputy clinical director at the Child Mind Institute, with deep expertise in anxiety, mood, and trauma-related disorders, and a strong focus on culturally responsive evidence-based care. Dr. Amber Carolles is a pediatric neuropsychologist at Sutter Health who helps families better understand and support children with ADHD, autism, and learning challenges. And Dr. Bradley Zickerman is a psychiatrist specializing in co-occurring mental health conditions and addiction in youth. He's a clinical associate professor at Stanford University, founder of the Stanford Youth Recovery Clinic, and medical director for Quest Intensive Outpatient Program for Youth at El Camino Hospital. With that, we're going to jump into our panel discussion. The first question is for Dr. Carolles. Dr. Carolles, based on your work with young children, how is screen time affecting brain development in kids under 5? And are there certain children who may be more vulnerable to its negative effects?
All right, thank you for that question. So I think a really important place to start would be the guidelines that are already pretty well established by the American Academy of Pediatrics. So for our kiddos under 18 months of age, we're really not finding benefits for screen time at all, with the exception of things like FaceTiming or video chatting family and friends. For 18 to 24-month-olds, if you choose to introduce screen time, it's really important that we're introducing what they call high-quality content, which I think of as educational, slow-paced, and enjoyed with a parent or other caregiver, so that they're getting kind of language skills development and comprehension skills development as well. And then for all kids under 5, it's really cited very widely that we don't want them to really exceed more than about an hour of screen time a day. Now, why is this really important for our kids under 5? So from 0 to 5, brain development, as you know, is quite rapid. So there's lots of different neural pathways, or you can think of them as learning highways that are being developed in different areas of the brain responsible for our language skills, our social skills, emotional regulation, problem solving, and motor skills, right? So screen time and content that we see either through touchscreen devices or by watching television programs, this is certainly can be exercising parts of the brain, but not all of them. And so we want to make sure that we're introducing balance into our young kids' brains so that they have the ability to exercise all different parts of their brain. If we're seeing kids spending more than 2-3 hours a day on screens, we're really seeing that that's stealing opportunities for the learning highways to be strengthened to other parts of the brain, particularly motor pathways, the frontal pathways that are including like our emotional regulation and our social pathways, right? Especially if we're watching or engaging in this screen time independently. Now, kids that I think are particularly vulnerable are kids that are what we think of as neurodivergent. And in my clinical practice, I see that screen time can be a pretty sticky conversation when it comes to kids with ADHD and autism particularly. And the reason for this, that I think, is that these are kids who already at baseline have difficulty with transitioning away from very fun, preferred activities. And so I see a lot of parents coming to me and saying, we see even more behavioral and emotional outbursts and meltdowns regarding times transitioning away from the iPad, right? And so that is something where, that can be difficult to manage and causes more kind of emotional distress in some circumstances. And then the other piece to that can be a potential concern, especially in this subset of kids, is that sometimes screens can be used as a pacifier, kind of an extended pacifier. And so for kids who are already delayed when it comes to their emotional regulation, we really want these kids to be exercising different coping strategies other than screens. And this is the case for all kids under 5. Every brain under 5 needs time and practice to develop all of these different skills, including the emotional regulation. But particularly for those kids where some of these skills can be delayed or need extra intervention for, we really want to make sure that parents are cognizant that using that as a pacifier can extend these symptoms over time and can worsen over time. And so that's why it's really particularly important that we're paying attention to these guidelines in that under 5 age range.
Wow, thank you. That was really helpful. I didn't realize how there was such a disproportionate effect on kids that have those neurodevelopmental challenges. Thank you. Now I'll turn it to Dr. Baker. You've been deeply involved in research on adolescent brain development. What are we learning about how screen use is affecting sleep in kids and teens?
All right, so moving on from some of the work that I focus on is not looking at those who are in the younger than 5 age group, looking more at the teens or even starting the very early development, so ages 9, 10, and through the teenage years. And my perspective is from research. So I'm at SRI International. It's a research institute, and a big part of my research focus is on sleep. So I will definitely always advocate for getting enough sleep. But I'm also, SRI is one of the research sites for a large study that's funded by NIH, our National Institutes of Health. It's called the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development, or nicely shortened, ABCD study. And that study has been longitudinally following more than 11,000 kids. They started at age 9 and 10 in about 2016. So we've been following them and tracking them every year since then, looking at their brains, doing a brain scan to look at how they develop, and looking at all their behaviors. And of course, if you think back to 2016, it really is when we're seeing such a burst in social media, gaming. It's just got bigger and bigger use since then. So we've been tracking this from a research perspective and seeing how does screen time use, social media use, video gaming, how does that influence or interact with the behaviors and the brain development of these early stage, first age 9, 10, 11, 12, that sort of early development. And then as we follow them, they are heading towards the 16, 17, 18 years, so we can really track the effects across the second decade of life. And if I give a few examples of what we're seeing with this large research study, sleep, again, is one of my focuses. And as part of the research study, we ask the kids about their use before bedtime. So we know that that's one particular area, time of day, where kids might be using social media a lot, or playing video games, or relaxing, but with a screen device. And the unfortunate thing is if it's close to bedtime, then it can start to delay the time when they might be going to bed. And so then they maybe get a shorter sleep time. And as you've been seeing flashing up on the screen while we were getting ready, we really do want our kids to be having about 9 hours of sleep at sort of the ages of 11, 12, or 10 hours of sleep. And so when you start seeing the time of going to sleep being pushed back because of using screens, then that isn't good for a healthy night's sleep, which means healthy night's sleep is good for their functioning at school, it's good for their emotions, their mood, it's good for their physical health, so really, really important. And then we also see if the kids are, about 2/3 of them have a screen device in the bedroom, and if they are not turning off the phone, sometimes they might be disturbed during the night with notifications. And while we don't always know the direction of their effects with our research, because sometimes the kids maybe hear the notification, they wake up, and then they are very tempted to go on their phone and get sort of, just like anyone can, not just kids, but they can get very absorbed by what's going on, and then that delays them going back to sleep. On the other hand, some kids may already be vulnerable, like they may not have such good sleep, or they may have some depressive symptoms already, and then they turn to use their phone, or they wake up at night and already without notifications, and then are using their phone. So the direction goes both ways, and so we just need to be cognizant of how these sort of growing use of phones, social media, as well as video gaming is interacting with behaviors in this sort of very important second development stage, which is the teenage years.
Wow, we can see that the digital devices are affecting sleep a lot. And with that, I'll turn to Dr. Dewan to ask, from your perspective as an educational leader, how are digital devices shaping student learning, focus, and behavior in today's classroom? Thinking about those neurodevelopmental pieces, the sleep pieces, and then what is happening actually in the classrooms.
I first want to thank the Healthier Kids Foundation for bringing us all together today to have these conversations. It is so important that we do work together in partnership to raise this awareness. It's also so integral and for us to demonstrate how health and education are so intertwined. We really cannot separate the two. And so these types of conversations across disciplines is really essential for helping us to understand how children are doing in schools and how technology is impacting their learning. We also do know from research and evidence and a lot of anecdotal information from teachers and parents that technology, devices, social media, all of those aspects have severely disrupted student learning for many, many students, and has contributed negatively to the emotional and social well-being of many young people. We also have heard a little bit about how those youngsters under the age of 5 and many schools are providing educational programs for children under the age of 5 are seeing differences in students' learning, their ability to attend, their engagement and learning, some restrictions on their ability to develop healthy relationships, and also language development that can sometimes be stunted. And we can see this direct correlation to the use of technology, social media, and excessive screen time. So one of the resources that I've often shared with schools is a book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and if you haven't checked it out, I would encourage it. But he suggests some new norms that I think affect families, but also schools. And he said that these norms are really necessary because as parents, as educators, as educational leaders, we are overprotecting our children in the real world and underprotecting them in the digital world online. And so he suggests no smartphones before high school, at school and at home, no social media before age 16, that schools be phone free, and that children have more opportunities for independence, for free play, time to be outside and experience the real world. And not likely directly as a result of Haidt's work, but certainly we are seeing for his work and others that the state of California is acting upon this policy recommendation, and that schools will now have a requirement to have policies that either ban or restrict cell phone use in schools. This is the Phone Free School Act, and it takes effect July 1st, 2026, but there's no reason for schools to wait until July 1st, 2026. This policy requires that the school come up with a set of procedures and recommendations, guidelines on either restricting or banning smartphone use during school hours. And that this is really, good news, I think, and encouraging and helpful to educators and parents. But it's also going to be, a bit of a dialogue and I think some challenging discussions ahead, because it will be up to individual school districts to make that decision. And so we can likely see variations in policy and also a lot of different opinions that educators might hold and parents might hold related to these policies. It is important to note that the law does not require all banning, and that there are some exceptions, perhaps for students with disabilities or for medical reasons, as well as emergency access during certain incidents. I think, again, this is encouraging news and good for schools. However, there will be some implementation barriers and a lot of things that we're going to talk about today on the panel that I think will be helpful in overcoming some of those barriers. So again, while we all potentially agree that there should be some limitations, we're going to struggle with implementation. What do these exact rules look like? How does it affect the behavior of individual young people? And what are we doing as adults around the young people with this implementation, including perhaps some of our own cell phone addiction or excessive technology use? Another thing that I think schools and parents should be aware of is that cell phone addiction, social media addiction, et cetera, are not necessarily recognized as individual addictions in the way that maybe other addictions are recognized, and that it is seen as a behavioral addiction. What that often means, I think, is that we don't really know or have a lot of great research around one, to diagnose it, and then two, what are the treatment plans or opportunities for mitigation that might be effective or specifically effective for young people who may be struggling in this way. And so I have a few thoughts that I wanted to share, and I do have some examples of these cell phone policies that you can locate through board docs or online. Local school district, Santa Clara Unified, has a draft policy already that can be utilized and looked at, and many school districts do already. But when I think about our role as educators and parents, I think about three categories. The first one is prevention. How do we prevent these types of struggles? And then secondly, protections. And then thirdly, partnership. And so for prevention, I think it's really important to make sure, as we're working with new babies and young toddlers and youngsters, to be super mindful about what we know about technology and social media, and honor these recommendations from pediatricians to have no cell phone use in babies. And then I also think it's really important for families to have some guidelines and things in place at home, including ensuring that there are a lot of activities and ways that we gather information that are not directly connected to a cell phone or to the internet. In terms of protections, I think there are a lot that we can do to protect our young people in these ways, educating them about some of the risk. Certainly, we might acknowledge that there's some benefits to technology, but it's also good to balance and then make sure that we're thinking about those tools that are already available to us in terms of parental controls or school controls on devices and social media. And then partnership, partnering with pediatricians, partnering as parents together in neighborhoods or in play groups and things like that, to have these resources outside of our social media, outside of our devices, to engage young people and to give them opportunities in the real world.
Thank you. That was actually a great segue into our next question for Dr. Gudino. How is screen time impacting kids with mental health challenges, and are there unique risks or patterns that caregivers and clinicians should be aware of?
Thank you so much for the question. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with this panel. As we really think about this being a really complex and complicated issue. So when we think about it in terms of developmental stages, when we think about it in terms of different settings, when we think about even just defining what technology means, it can mean so many different things, or what social media means, or what screen time can mean, that often we're trying to address a really complicated problem and trying to take action, and that's a really challenging thing to do. So from my perspective, I'm primarily working with kids and families that are presenting with mental health issues or behavioral issues. So that's a very narrow piece of the pie, but that's what I'm focused on. So really thinking about what's that intersection between mental health and the way that technology shows up in a child's life. We were having some conversations this morning and really thinking about there's no aspect of a child's life that isn't somehow overlapping with technology. And that it becomes really, really challenging to think about how does one manage that as a parent, as an educator. But that's a lot of what we're trying to do. So in our work, we really focus on understanding what's problematic about the use. How is it getting in the way of somebody's daily functioning? Is it getting in the way of relationships? Is it getting in the way of parent-child conflict? Is it getting in the way of sleep? Right? So we're often trying to understand what's the function of the technology use and what about it is problematic. And that often leads us to better clues about potential mechanisms or things that are driving some of the mental health challenges. So sleep is a really good example of one. We have lots of parents, for example, that are very distressed by their child being on their phone at night, or especially when they sneak the phone, right? They're saying, I found out that they were using it in the middle of the night. But that's a really clear thing for us to then say, how do we work around this? What are the contingencies that are in place? What's been communicated about cell phone use within this family? What were they doing? How is it that they got the phone? So really being really deliberate and thoughtful about what about this is problematic to then work backwards towards solutions. But the overarching news that we hear out there is that there is this overlap between time spent on screens and mental health challenges, particularly for anxiety and depression. And I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to. But as our colleagues were saying, we don't really know yet a lot about what's the directionality or what's causing what. So it's a really important statistic to know and a really important fact to be aware of. But we want to be able to step back and think about what makes something problematic. Now, there's a few things that really, really jump out, and that is if kids are exposed to explicit information about high-risk behavior, things like self-harm and suicide, that those are clearly having a negative impact on kids. The other is cyberbullying, right? If a lot of our interaction is spent being the victims of violence or perpetrating that violence against other people, that those are really challenging things as well. And then the third being about how one engages with technology. Right, that there's lots of platforms that are really designed to keep us engaged longer and longer and longer. As somebody who recently took a trip to Las Vegas, it was really it was a great reminder to think about how we can set up environments in our interactions to really keep us engaged. Right, and those are clearly problematic things. But we really want to step back and be able to think about beyond those three things. How do we approach the challenges that we see on a daily basis? One thing that we often see in our work is that there's a positive role for technology as well. I think about somebody that I just worked with this week, really thinking about medication compliance and the importance of their phone and those reminders for remembering to take their medications and get their refills. I think about kids that work with journaling or mood ratings, where we're often using the data that they're collecting from their phones to then inform the work that we do. And then we also think about brief interventions or coaching supports or things that are available very easily to a large population of adolescents that really provides that access to mental health services with few barriers. So there are potentials there for really positive effects. But a lot of what we're also thinking about is how do we balance that with the challenges that are specific to this unique child? And if we're working with somebody that already has challenges with social relationships or is at high risk for developing mental health issues or has difficulties with executive functioning or impulsivity, that in those cases we're often seeing the same challenges that might show up in real life interactions, but they're showing up in a very different way when they're interacting online, right? So we're often thinking about how do we think about this child holistically or this family holistically, And because in our work we're focused on intervention, we're often working directly with parents to say, what can we do to set this child up for success, to set this family up for success? But I think what I'm looking forward to in this conversation is that it has to be a shared responsibility, right? It can't be enough to just say each parent needs to monitor what their child does, because again, technology is available to us 24 hours a day. And it really does require a coordinated effort across schools, communities, tech companies, right, to really think about how we're creating a world and a culture and some norms around how we engage with technology at different ages. So I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Thank you. You know, all four of our first panelists have shared so much about what are some of the risks and what are some of those challenging behaviors. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Zickerman with this question, because you work so closely with youth who are struggling with addiction, including to technology. So I'm wondering, what are some early signs that adults, parents, educators can look for of social media or gaming addiction? And then how can the caring adults really respond in a supportive way?
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's also nice going last and hearing all the other experts, and I can sort of adapt my my talking points a bit. In 2019, it was mentioned that I started what we call our youth recovery clinic at Stanford. I thought I would be treating like 100% substance addictions. At this point, about 30% of my referral requests are for digital technology addictions, and most of that is actually social media addiction concerns. As far as some of the warning signs that we might see of like an early developing social media addiction, you can say other technology addictions as well. I don't know if we really have great research shows like what are the first signs that you'll see, but I'm glad that several of our panel members have mentioned sleep. I do think that clinically, that is probably the first sign that I notice that we see a disruption in sleep. You know, the idea of getting 8 to 10 hours. I'll work with patients who might not be able to fall asleep until 6 or 7 in the morning, and they're just on their phone, browsing aimlessly around social media, and then of course, you know, you can't go to school, you can't really function, and lack of sleep is of course linked to increased rates of depression, anxiety. So if I had to say one sign of maybe a percolating technology addiction, probably sleep is what I would mention first. But overall, we look at functional impairments. Are you seeing a change in academics? Are you seeing a change in how your kid is interacting within the family? Are they just wanting to spend all their time at home in their room, isolated from family? Are they resistant to having meals together? Is it the only activity that they want to engage in? If you try and pull your kid away from their phone, from a game, are they just completely resistant? Are you mentioning other activities they can maybe try engaging in? There's like, no, I'm not going to do that. Those are signs of maybe a concern developing. And then I'd also say, you know, this goes beyond a behavioral concern at this point. We have enough research to back the idea that this is actually biological, that something like social media, this was not designed with great intentions. It really is designed to work and function like a slot machine. They're essentially gambling apps. If you think about it, you post something on Instagram, and you know, you're looking for feedback. You're looking for you know, how many likes I get, how many subscribers, how many new comments I get. So you constantly check your phone for those reactions, those dopamine hits. This actually completely affects our dopamine system in ways that substances can. And we have provisional criteria for internet gaming disorder in the DSM-5. That's our diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. And the DSM-5 came out in, I think it was 2013. You know, most of these apps weren't around. People weren't, you know, on their smartphone and browsing, you know, Instagram and TikTok the way that they are now. So we didn't understand that this was a concern the last time that we updated what we consider mental health disorders. We don't know when the DSM-6 will come out. I would be shocked if they didn't have specific accepted criteria for various forms of internet addictions, including video game addictions, including social media addictions. The provisional criteria for internet gaming disorder, you can do a Google search for it. There's 11 criteria. The idea is if you meet 5 of those criteria, there's a concern there for an addiction. I actually prefer to look at our substance use criteria, and you can just exchange the word substance use for social media, and it completely works. And I think that shows how powerful and toxic this stuff can be, that you can essentially treat it like a substance. And when I'm actually treating patients clinically, in a lot of ways, the therapies that I engage in are almost entirely same therapies that I engage in with patients, families where there's a substance use concern. And then the second part, what are some maybe ideas for? Yeah, the kind of support, your kid at home if you think there's a concern. I'd say try your best to not have an angry, confrontational argument about this. We're getting weird feedback.
Yeah,
I don't know what's going on. Try and have a curious conversation. I think I was holding this too close, maybe. Try and have a curious conversation if you are concerned about social media use, for instance, and ask your kid, like, what is the attraction to it? Why do you feel like you're on this so much? What do you need from this? And I think it's also really healthy to try and build a family media plan together. Sure, when I'm asked what the best piece of advice I can give the families about this is, it's start family media planning literally the moment your kid is born. But we can still work with you and make good changes if you're coming to the clinic and your kid is 15, 16 years old and you're concerned. I think trying to coordinate as a family is really important. I think it's also important to understand that you can visit your pediatrician. You can find there are experts out there in the community that are specifically trying to work with and treat internet addictions.
That's really helpful. And so that really also leads us into our next question, which is for everybody, but I'll start with Dr. Baker's perspective on sleep. So the question is, as we think about the growing roles of digital devices in children's lives, what steps can we take collectively as parents, professionals, and communities to guide them towards that healthy, balanced use? And we're gonna hear from everybody their unique lens and thinking about, like you mentioned, the family media plan. So what could that look like for specific developmental ranges, for around specific areas on sleep, maybe for our children that have some learning differences or mental health challenges, or maybe a tendency towards addiction. And then of course, how could that look different in schools, and really how do we collaborate among all of those professionals and advocate for the healthy use of digital devices in our children? So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. B.
All right, and I think we've heard this family media plan come up in a couple of the talks, and so the American Academy of Pediatrics does recommend that families develop a plan. But just building off on some of the things we've heard, so I have 2 teenagers at home, and so sometimes when I'm hearing about the fact that they don't go to sleep early, and then also communicate with them. And of course, as when you're looking at teenagers, they don't really want to communicate much with parents. They want to communicate with their friends, and also sleep changes. There's so many biological changes, so they have this natural tendency to want to go to bed later. It's like their biology of their teenage bodies tends to go later and later. And so it's a really hard situation in these teenage years to try and first make sure that they're getting enough sleep, going to bed early early enough because of what they have to do the next day, and then also communication. But definitely when thinking about a family media plan specifically, we know that from our research that some of the protective factors are against, say, developing some of the higher depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, is parental involvement or monitoring and communication. So, talking with your kids and asking what are they doing in their day, keeping that line of communication open is important, and knowing what they're doing is a protective factor. So with a family media plan, it really does need to be developed considering the age of the child and the specific situation for the family. And it can be things like, don't use your phone while you're eating dinner. Again, it's really, in general, it's important and very healthy to have meals as a family with the child, and keeping the screens away from that is a good idea. Then similarly around bedtime, it would be good to not to allow the phone right next to the bed, or to set up a plan as if the notifications are silenced. I mean, ideally, it's better to have the phone not in the bedroom. But again, it's part of a discussion with your child. And then also what they again, communication is so important. So have them being able to speak to you about if they've seen anything online that's inappropriate, they can talk to you. Then that's helps them to be aware and protect them from what they might be exposed to online. Because we know, of course, the content, if there's cyberbullying, all those factors are very negative. I think that's just some of the pieces which you could be talking about and considering as a family.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I love that thought about having, in some cases it'll be the parent, and in other cases it'll be a positive adult in the life of the child or youth. And so at least, for those who are not work with many kids and not necessarily the parent of all of those kids, right, making sure that they know that they can approach you to talk about any issues, because not every family is yet going to have that family media plan. I'm wondering if Dr. Corliss or Dr. Gudinho, if you have any thoughts about, how as clinicians of young people, or children that are very young or with learning disabilities, and then children with any maybe mental health issues, how might a media plan look different for them in the home as well as in a school? And then of course, Dr. Zuckerman, if you have anything that you want to add to that, and then we'll address the schools as well.
I can start.
Go ahead.
So I think the family media plan is a really important first step, but often what we're seeing is that it's going to be an ongoing conversation, right? It's going to start a framework for approaching this over and over and over again. And so often what we're seeing is like the day-to-day, how do you work with a family to implement that plan? How do we work with parents or caregivers to really be able to communicate what's the family's perspective on this? Why do we want to eat together? How do we make that dinner more reinforcing than whatever's on the phone, right? That it's really about putting those pieces together to say, that's a really good end goal to have, but what's getting in the way of that? So it's often really thinking about how we create those stronger relationships so that it's clear to us why we want to limit our screen time when we're together. And so that we're really working actively to make sure that those interactions are as positive and engaging as they can be. The other piece is really working with individuals in their own development, right? As somebody's developing self-control, like how can we support them and provide that scaffolding or that feedback for a young child or a teen to be able to engage with something in a new way or in a healthy way. So often we're working with even just basic mindful use of something. Which apps are we using? Why are we using them? And can we really start to help to develop or cultivate that awareness in the moment? I was eating breakfast this morning listening to a mindfulness app, right? So I was trying to remember, listening to my phone, but also being mindful as I'm doing that. So really thinking about providing that scaffolding for kids to be able to make those connections so that we're not setting them up for failure, right? We're saying we want you to be fully in control, but what is the child's current capacity and how can we as caregivers or as adults provide that structure to get them to that next stage?
Yeah, that's great. To your point earlier about starting a family media plan at the time of birth, one of my areas of passion is early intervention. And I think that this is also an area in which, in this day and age, we have to intervene early. And to your point, we have to be consistent in our intervention of boundaries around screen time for ourselves, setting the example as parents in the household, right? And also for our children, really making sure that, especially for younger children, right? And that shifts over time to hand over autonomy and practice of that control with devices as kids enter teenage years, but especially for our kiddos under 7, 8 years old, where the frontal capacity is not developed, and we're in these attentional systems that are developing in the brain. This is a really critical time period. We want to make sure that really parents are in control of devices and that is a consistent implementation. So I talk in my practice less about a family media plan, and I speak more generally about good parenting practices. And these are guidelines that are across different types of parenting practices, but especially related to media. It's very important that we're consistent, that we're clear in our expectations, that the expectations are explained to our kiddos beforehand, right? So we're not taking an iPad away in the middle of activity. We're giving warnings. This is something that happens every single day. So that's the behavioral side of the early intervention. And then the second piece is the emotional regulation side and what that means for the type of content that we're exposing to our kids, especially in these younger years. So that's age-appropriate content, right? So we're wanting to make sure that we're not kind of letting our kids run rampant on YouTube Shorts or even YouTube Kids. I mean, there's some content that pops up that's very disturbing, and children's brains are not emotionally prepared to see some of the content that pops up sometimes. I've heard horror stories about that. So there's that piece of the information. And also, I was talking earlier about high quality content. So that can be educational from like a pre-academic sense, which there's lots of great shows that are talking about ABCs and learning our numbers, and that's great. But also there's lots of different opportunities to learn through content as well. There is a good side of screen time, right? I always say that if you had the choice between showing your kid a 90-minute Disney movie or letting them be on YouTube for 45 minutes, take the opportunity to let them watch the movie for 90 minutes, especially if it's set in a moral universe where we're learning about character development over a long period in which our attentional system is being taxed and we're developing that kind of slower pace. That can be a great use of screen time, especially if mom and dad are sitting there and talking us through, well, what did that character do? And what do you think they're thinking? And why do you think they made that choice, right? That's a great use of screen time. And so there is, when we're thinking about parenting practices as it relates to how is screen time going to work for our family, for our different individual children, because every children is going to interact with these devices differently and use these as different types of outlets. What kind of aligns with your family value system? And use that to be a measure and a guide about like what kind of content we're allowing in the home, and how that aligns. So from a family media perspective, I guess to sum that all up would be, think about your family values. Think about how you want to embody those values and how you want to consistently teach your child those values. And then I think if we start that from a really early age, that's going to follow them into their preteen and teen years. And hopefully the idea is that you've set a healthy foundation so that they are able to kind of regulate that more for themselves once we have deemed that they're an appropriate age to do so.
I love that part about the values. That's super helpful. Dr. Zuckerman, do you want to add any clinical perspectives?
Sure. I think modeling behavior is so important. If you're bringing your kid into the clinic because you think they have a problem with technology use and they're staying up really late, for instance, I find out that a parent is also on their phone until midnight, you can't really expect your kid to make a change if you aren't also going to address your own use. And it's the same thing with substance use. I get families that come in, they have a child who they're concerned has been using cannabis products. And I know maybe there's legalization in this state now, but you can't expect your kid to stop using cannabis if you are actually using cannabis, particularly within the home. So I think with technology, there has to be good modeling of desired habits. I'd also say I I say quite strongly, actually, there should be no phone charging within the bedroom. And I sometimes get pushback from parents about that. I say, you can't expect your kid to make this change if you aren't also going to make this change. This is something that the entire family has to figure out a place where everyone's going to charge their devices. There really shouldn't be, I think, any form of technology within the bedroom, whether it's a phone, a television, a computer, Chromebook, whatever that might be. Again, I'm really glad we're talking about early intervention. The best piece of advice I think I can give is start as early as possible, thinking about how you want to plan media use within the family. I get some pretty severe presentations clinically when it comes to technology addictions, and I actually find it in so many ways more challenging to treat certain forms of technology addictions than even something like an opioid use disorder. At least with something like an opioid use disorder, I have medications that I can use to directly treat the condition. There isn't anything like that for something like social media use disorders. So it's really difficult to navigate, even for me in clinic, if I get someone coming in who's 15, 16, 17 years old. So early intervention is the point I really can't emphasize enough.
Great, thank you. I'd love to hear from Dr. Dewan in terms of now, we talked a lot about in a family unit, how can families really focus on that prevention side, looking at the values, setting a plan. So how can schools also look at their values, look at how to be role models and how to lead by example, and really focus on that prevention side and really incorporate appropriate use of smartphones, if at all, and also thinking even beyond smartphones, what does it look like when kids have devices that they need to use to do their homework, even at the elementary level? How can schools really be part of a proactive conversation?
I think a humanistic and empathetic approach is really necessary. I mean, we just hear so often about how overwhelming all of this really is. And certainly there's a lot of promotion of the benefits of technology for learning, and technology is all around us and more is coming. So I think we heard a little bit today about some very specific things like the dangers of social media and alternatives for screen time. And I think those apply in schools as well. And the other piece that I would really emphasize is that schools are not just there to educate the students, they're also there to educate and partner with parents. And so a lot of what schools can do is to partner with parents to raise awareness and to help parents both at home and also for parents to help at school. I think advocating for some policies and regulations that accurately warn parents and others of the risk of some of these things. I think back to how we believed for many decades that cigarette smoking wasn't harmful. The evidence, the research, it was marketed to us and we were told that it wasn't harmful, and certainly today we know that it is. And I think some of these technology tools have emerging evidence that they are harmful, and we need to more accurately communicate and warn about those things, and potentially label them or have more restrictions around their use. The other piece that an approach that I come from is I'm a new grandparent. I have a 22-month-old granddaughter, and my son and daughter-in-law have rules that no technology around our granddaughter. And so often people ask me, do you have pictures of your granddaughter? I'm like, I don't really have that many because we're not allowed to have phones, have our phone around our granddaughter. And so we're very limited. We have certain times when we can take pictures and things like that. And we talk to her as a camera and we're taking a picture. But I think, it's important for us to be compassionate and empathetic in our approach with families and with educators and with schools to honor those types of guidelines. Like, we really are partners in ensuring the healthy development of our young people. And so I think that applies to schools as well. And we're talking a lot today about the specifics around technology. And I think another approach for us is around engagement and understanding how children learn. Just as we were talking about like best practices for parenting, I think best practices for instruction can apply and really help us mitigate the overuse of technology in the schools. And one recent resource that I came across and that we shared at the Kids in Common, our annual Children's Summit, is this book, The Disengaged Teen, and really understanding the different learning modes that young people have, and then tailoring some of our approaches to helping them re-engage, to address their social emotional needs and differences, and help them to learn better, feel better, because we know a lot of our young people are anxious and depressed, and also to live better. And to enjoy teaching and to enjoy parenting more as well. And so this is a resource that I would recommend.
Thank you. We're going to continue the conversation, but I wanted to ask if anyone has questions that they've written down on their cards that haven't already been addressed by the panel. You can pass those to the ends of the aisles and then raise them up, and staff will come around and collect the cards, and then we'll answer the question somewhat collectively. So I'll turn back to the panel and ask, right, I think Dr. Dewan did a great job of really framing schools as part of the community and how to engage adults and young people in things outside of technology. Do we have any thoughts on how communities can do that collectively, right? I think it's really challenging if you're the only grandparent or parent or even school that is not allowing technology in, in a for all sort of way. How do we support each other in this sort of moving forward into this new phase of there's lots of devices, everyone has them. The social norm currently is just have your devices all of the time. How can we support each other to kind of scale that back and make it more appropriate?
I'd be happy to start with that. So I think that it's really important that as we have these great new policies that are coming about, like you said, sometimes it can be a little bit slow moving, and the implementation from a top-down level can oftentimes be challenging. And so I think that something that parents can do right away is to get together with their friends' immediate group and get to know their parents if you haven't already. And you can even start, it doesn't even have to be community-wide. It can be something that can start happening on an individual basis where you get together with your child's friends and you can say, hey, we're going to stay strong and we're not going to introduce phones until, this wait to eighth movement, the 8th grade. And then if, all these buddies and then that can then expand to maybe our entire grade level from a parent's perspective. As parents, we are really going to hold strong, right? And that is really working to make sure that kids are not feeling singled out or not feeling like they're the only one who's doesn't have access to Snapchat, right? Because there is this balance between we don't want to isolate our kids. We want to make sure that they have the tools to be successful socially. And so I think from a community standpoint, it can happen community-wise, but it can also happen individually, just starting with friend groups. So I think that's something that is talked about in the anxious generation a lot, a focus of more real life interactions, maybe understanding that part of our family values is we're going to be in the real world. We're going to have real world experiences. And what that might mean is that from a parental perspective and a parenting perspective, we have to start to regulate our own anxiety as well and realize that part of removing our kids from primarily social media or device-driven life is also allowing them the experiences to live in the real world. And I think that is also something that as parents, that their anxiety can get in the way a lot as well. because it's easier to have eyes on our kids when they're at home talking on social media versus at the mall with their friends. But I think that we're starting to realize that the pendulum has swung too much in that direction, and now we're realizing that that's unsafe and not promoting healthy development as well. So understanding from like a parent perspective, it's great that we're having top-down solutions, and that's awesome. But I think that the bottom down is going to come and have to meet in the middle as well in order for this to be a successful endeavor.
Along those same lines, the implementation is going to be so critical, and the approach that we take, whether it's a punitive approach, a disciplinary approach, versus a recognition that a lot of these tools were designed to do what they're doing to our young people.
I'll just echo this idea that developing these group norms is really, really important. And we're always going to have family-specific norms or individual beliefs and preferences. But as we're connecting this bottom-up and top-down, that we're developing norms as a society, and maybe starting with a school or starting with a grade or a state. But that's the process that we really have to focus in on. And the other piece I want to highlight that my colleagues mentioned is we also have to give attention to what we're doing when we're not on devices. So if we're saying let's just ban screens, that may sound that it's a first step, but what are kids supposed to be doing in that other time? And whether it's making sure that our educational practices are meeting kids' needs, or that our social expectations for kids or social opportunities are meeting the needs of kids as well.
Looks like there's a lot of questions. The anxious generation, as I've mentioned a few times now, I'll mention again. I think this is an essential text that everyone should be reading. Maybe students should be reading it, and we should treat it like Shakespeare. I don't know. Is Shakespeare still being read in schools? I don't know. But I think teens would probably even get a lot out of it and understand like how potentially harmful technology can be if we're not regulating it. And we're just in a different time. When I was growing up, okay, Sega and N64 and the original Xbox versions, these weren't as immersive. And I didn't grow up with really any regulations around devices, but I probably didn't need to because this stuff wasn't so overwhelming and immersive. And I recognize I have a young kid at home now. Like I'm absolutely have to set limits and regulations with this stuff.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine some of the questions, but there are a few in here that are asking about what are the demographics of our patients that are at higher risk. We talked a little bit about children who have autism spectrum disorder, ADD, mental health conditions. So specifically, right there, there's a question about like for the patients that are in the recovery center and maybe even at Quest at El Camino, what are the demographics in terms of income level? And then same thing for Child Mind Institute as well as in your practice at Sutter Health, Dr. Crowley. Do you see or what are the disparities depending on the demographics of your patients? And that's really for all three of the clinicians here.
I guess I can start. As far as the recovery clinic, I'm able to see private insurances as well as Medi-Cal. The Quest program is mostly private insurance, so we do get, I think, an interesting demographic. And as far as maybe like the co-occurring aspects of what we see in those clinics, I think working with children and teens with ASD is quite interesting, and the sort of correlation that we'll see with gaming, and it definitely presents in a different way than working with someone who has a social media addiction, which we are understanding more that it is very much linked to something like ADHD, for instance. And that I also mentioned too, there's a comment I think about, we're trying to figure out how to correlate, like if you have a problem with something like social media addiction and depression, like what came first. And we have emerging evidence, and we understand that there's actually And I'll say this clinically that there's a real causation between technology and the actual developing of something like depression.
Yeah, so I can speak more to the neurodevelopmental vulnerabilities. So specifically for ADHD, there's strong evidence that kids who have ADHD and are having excessive screen time use, which I would define as more than 2 or 3 hours per day outside of school, we know that this is increasing or decreasing their ability to inhibit their impulses, right, which is one of the core characteristics of ADHD. And we know that this is decreasing their attentional abilities even further, right? So we know that this excessive screen time use, and probably, I don't think the research does a great job at capturing quality of screen time use, and I do think that that's important to kind of individualize across kids. But on aggregate, we know that excessive screen time use in kids with ADHD is causing worse ADHD symptoms over a longer period of time, and that's a real concern. The opposite is also true. So and I want to be very clear, screen time does not cause ADHD, does not cause any neurodevelopmental concern at all. However, we know that there are interactions between neurological vulnerabilities, genetic vulnerabilities, and environmental and social stressors that can emerge and present as these disorders, or can kind of show up as these disorders. And so we know that excessive screen time use also is associated with a higher risk of being diagnosed with ADHD, and to some extent, emerging evidence is showing autism as well. And so that is something I think we all need to be very aware of, especially if we are interacting with parents of kids with ADHD or interacting with kids with ADHD in the classroom as well. This is because the attentional circuits, right, especially, you mentioned Vegas, we've talked about slot machines. This is essentially, especially my touchscreen devices, right? I have a device that I am in control of. And if I'm on a low quality game, right? So for example, I don't know, like our Candy Crushes, right? This is a short-term game. It's happening within the span of 30 seconds to a minute. I have a limited number of lives, right? So there's that intermittent reinforcement that is essentially a slot machine, right? We don't know when we're going to pass the level or not, right? This is what I would consider fast-paced, attentionally demanding, immersive, and poor quality content versus something like a Minecraft where it's open-ended, right? It's emulating that kind of open-ended, explorative, creative play, especially, supervised by an adult. But there's differences there as well. And then I just wanted to point out, and maybe you'd want to speak to this as well, I don't have access to financial demographics or anything else like that from my patients. But I know in the research, there's also evidence to support that kids who are coming from lower income backgrounds are more vulnerable to the impacts of screen time. And I think to your point about entering these conversations with curiosity and with compassion is really important, especially in this area, because these kids might be at home alone, right? Parents might not be around, or screens might be a really essential tool in these families to keep these kids safe and entertained and educated, especially in the absence of a caregiver or multiple caregivers or other siblings who are around as well. And so it's important to balance that between what are activities that we can fund for these kids that kind of helps to balance that out as well. So that's the two pieces I've come across as well in my personal practice and in the research.
And I just want to step in there with the research just to support what you're saying, because we do see with research for the teenagers, like with the ABCD study, that there are socio-demographic differences in the amount of time that kids are spending on social media or gaming, the different components. So it is, like you say, the kids from the families of lower socioeconomics are more likely to be using more screens. And I think it's to the point that we're all trying to make that this is not just the family or the individual have to make changes. It's a community change to also provide other alternatives of where they can safely be doing other activities that are not on the screen. And then there's another important demographic difference, which is also gender. So for example, girls are more likely to use more social media than boys, and boys are more likely to do more video gaming than girls.
So there is a question specifically for Dr. Godinho about how to be consistent with screen time restrictions in split households. I'm not sure if you're seeing that in your practice, right?
Yeah.
How can families be consistent? And then if there isn't that option, I'll add this to the question. How can the parent or household that is trying to be supportive of a healthy use of devices really address that?
It's such a great question. One place to start is to really think of it as it's always a work in progress, right? So even if we have the best conversation and set the best goals, we're going to have to see if that actually plays out, and we have to see what got in the way when we all agreed to put our phones down, but then one of us picked it up. What was it? What was it about that situation that made it challenging, and how do we give ourselves the grace and the opportunity to keep improving, right? So we want to think of it as an ongoing process. Hopefully we have good communication across caregivers, and we can think about what are those shared values about how we're raising this child, and how can we create that consistency across households. So that's always the first place to start. But again, there may be some variability in terms of how that's implemented. But if we can really narrow it down to what are the really key pieces that we want to communicate as co-parents, that's one place to start. And then if that's not possible, for us to again be really clear about within this household, how do we think about media? How do we think about technology? And why is it important for us to do it differently in this house? So ideally, we start with a shared understanding and a co-parenting plan that really helps us communicate this across different settings. But if it's grounded in values and it's grounded in why we do the things that we do, that it should make it easier to generalize to different settings, right? So this is how we behave whether we're at home or in public, because it's important to our family, because we understand that this is why we're doing it. So if we could really ground it in values, I think that helps. But it's one of the biggest challenges we see.
For sure. There is a question here about dumb phones. That that there are phones that are specifically for seniors that are pretty simple, and then there is another nicer word for dumb phones, that it's phones that really are just phones and not the smartphones. Do we have any research or any thoughts about how to integrate smartphones into the use, or how to maybe encourage or appropriately encourage youth to use a phone that's not a smartphone, and how can maybe just speak a little bit more to that? Anybody? Don't know.
Well, I don't have a comment about the dumb phone, but one thing I'm thinking of, like with sleep, and in terms of whether a lot of kids will say, I want my phone next to my bed because of my alarm clock, and then a good option for that is to get a plain old alarm clock, and then that they can just, all it does is the alarm, so that they don't use that as an excuse.
I'm not familiar with any research about the dumb phone movement, but I do think that that might be a good option for families with parents who are a little bit more anxious about their child's whereabouts. I know that it feels, I think, more grounding to be connected to our kids. And if that is a way that we can encourage parents to let their kids have more real world opportunities to walk to their friends in the neighborhood, to go somewhere with friends and practice that independence, I think that that's a wonderful idea. And I think that that mitigates a lot of the risks that we're talking about, which is being connected online and having our attentional systems taxed. And, it has the secondary effect of, okay, well, I'm still can be connected to my friends even when I'm not in person. We can pick up the phone and call, which, 5 or 6 years ago would have been the bane of many teenagers' experience, and mine as well. But I think that we can edge our way back there. But I'm not sure if there's any research support for that yet.
I don't believe so. And I think maybe my interpretation of the question is, if you're trying to transition from a smartphone to these non-smartphones, how will that go? And a lot of times we see what we call an extinction burst, which means things will get a lot worse before it gets better, and you have to stay the course if you make those changes. If you, go a day, if you go a week, 2 weeks, it's probably not going to be enough time to actually make that transition. But if you give it a month, eventually your kid is going to adapt the life with not having a smartphone and access to whatever apps they were on previously.
Thank you. we'll take the last 5 or 10 minutes or so to request. If you can each share, and we'll maybe just go down this line. Repeat the names of the books or resources that you've recommended, and then if you have any recommendations for, where could someone find a family media plan? Where could someone find, a school cell phone policy? Where could someone find activities that they can do outdoors that don't require the use of digital devices? That's, some of the questions that are combined on here. And we'll just go down the line and share, what would you recommend as a takeaway if you do one thing, read this book, or look at this website, have this conversation with someone that you work with or in your household, sort of a thing.
When our panelists were talking, I was thinking about a conversation I had with a friend who went on a really lovely and very expensive vacation. And on the vacation, they brought their son and daughter and their 4 kids, and the kids were aged like 3 to 18. And they tried really hard to engage in activities and do things outdoors and swim in the pool and do all of these things. But the mom, the dad, and the 4 kids from age 3 to 18 were essentially on their phones, on their devices for the entire trip. And so as a grandparent, my friend was very frustrated. And so I think one of the takeaways, recommendations that I hope people leave with today is just to have conversations, empathetic, curious, humanistic conversations about having dialogue and doing things together in community and in family. Some of the resources that I recommended, The Anxious Generation and The Disengaged Teen, Anna Lemke's work, Dopamine Nation, is also a great, powerful resource. And you can find sample policies for cell phone use on the California School Board Association website. Also, if you search board docs, there's a lot of just public-facing examples from school districts all across California.
As far as resources, I will mention again The Anxious Generation. I think this is an essential text. Dopamine Nation is a great read too about this space. Jonathan Haidt's personal website, it's just a wealth of resources, information about screen and technology use. Catherine Price is another really expert in this field who works closely with Jonathan Haidt. She has her own website with an incredible resource section. And then also plug the Yonder pouch system. If you are a school official, you're thinking about how to implement a no phone policy. I really think Yonder is a great way to think about doing this. If you're not familiar with Yonder, increasingly in schools, they will actually work with schools to implement their pouch system, and basically they'll have like sites within school, usually at the doors, where you essentially have to put your phone in the pouch, lock it, and then that's the only like locking station that's available. So then you have your phone on you, and kids find that they have more agency, and it's not taken away from them, but it can't be used in any way. So I'm a big fan of that. So I guess that's what I would plug.
All right, I think a good resource for a family media plan can be at the American Academy of Pediatrics website. And I think just thinking of all my thoughts of our panel discussion, I would say balance is a good place to land on, where there can be some times for the screen use, but there needs to be options given to our kids for other activities, and to make sure that they are exposed and encouraged to do the other activities, whether it's at school-related activities or other community activities, other things that can keep them busy in a happy and occupied way, so that they're not only left with it's just easy to sit on their device.
Yeah, so second and third, all of those recommendations. A couple of websites that are really helpful. Commonsensemedia.org also has templates for family media plans, and lots of good blog posts about how to engage children positively with screen time, as well as common sense approaches to that. I think they also have a list of good video games options and things like that, versus more attentionally taxing options. So that could be a good place to start. There's also a website. It used to be called AHA Parenting. I think now it's called peacefulparenting.org or .com. And that's also a wealth of information for parenting practices in general. But as it relates, I do think that they have a media tab on there as well. And then I'll plug a podcast. Good Inside with Dr. Becky is a great podcast, and she's had a few podcast episodes specifically about screen time across the different age ranges. So I would check that out if that's something that you're interested in listening to further. And then I guess my last piece of advice, specific to my kind of 0 to 5 carve out that I've had here today, is the longer that we can stretch kids before we introduce them to screens on a regular basis. I really do think that is going to be preventative and protective for their brain development in the future. And so if that's conversations, and again, I think that has to be more of the more that it is kind of socially normed and normed within our communities, within our friend groups, within our families, I think that it is going to be much easier to implement. So I understand there's a lot of, coming at this at an individual level is very difficult, but the more that we talk about this and come from a school perspective, a community perspective, a clinical perspective, and a parenting perspective, I do really think that that's going to be very, very helpful for our kids.
As far as resources, I'm going to put a plug in for childmind.org. We have a wonderful parent resource center, but also a wealth of articles, both in terms of short digestible formats. They're all translated into Spanish as well. We have a video series that's especially focused towards parents called Positive Parenting, Thriving Kids, which addresses topics that are important to parents. This is one of those topics, and it includes feedback from experts, from clinicians, and from kids and families themselves. So I think it's a really great resource for caregivers and for clinicians, for policymakers. As far as a takeaway for me, it's really important to move from a general sense that technology is bad for kids to really thinking about how is it impacting my specific child, or how is it impacting kids within our schools, for example, because that really gets us much closer to thinking about solutions. And if it's something where we're saying the phone is bad because it's getting in the way of our interactions, that really then says, well, what do we do to improve our interactions with our kids? Or what do we do to encourage more social interactions or more physical activity, for example? So really being able to specify what about it is problematic and how it's getting in the way of that child's life, I think gets us much closer to thinking about short-term things that we can do as we're waiting for better science to really inform the way forward.
Wow, thank you. I love the wealth of resources and knowledge here, and really that perspective of each step of the developmental process for our youth going to be different for each child, and how they engage with digital devices is going to really be that parents and caring adults have the most impact by addressing the individual needs and the solutions for that child, which is challenging when you're looking at big systems levels. So I really, really want to thank our panel for being here today. I have learned so much, and I'm sure that the audience has as well. It's truly been an honor for me to moderate this discussion and get to know you and engage with all of you. I also want to thank Healthier Kids Foundation for hosting the symposium on this really important and quite, frankly, very timely topic. And of course, I want to thank all of you, especially our dignitaries who are in the audience, for spending this morning with us. It has been a to get to some of you that I've talked to before the presentation this morning. I want to also take just a moment to do a final bit of housekeeping before we wrap up, to note that please make sure that you take all of your belongings with you. and that you exit very carefully. The lights don't get any brighter, so you are going to have to walk out carefully. And then there will be a showing of a movie in here, I think in the next half hour or so, so people will be starting to come in. So I just want to recognize, making sure that you take all of your belongings with you. So with that, I'll ask you to give a round of applause to our fabulous panel. Thank you all so very much.